I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this animated picture. It's a picture of Lyle. Some of our children may know who this is. It's from a recent animated movie called Lyle Crocodile. And Lyle is a crocodile, but he's not just a crocodile, except he can sing. I mean, that's the most bizarre thing. You never put those two things together, a crocodile that actually sings. And he's discovered by a very charismatic magician called Hector, who makes a living by doing extraordinary feats. And when he sees Lyle and he's singing, he thinks he can make a lot of money through him. And he takes Lyle to his shows, but except there is one problem. Lyle has tremendous stage fright. He freezes when the spotlights are on and the crowds are all looking at him. He gets very self-conscious about that. And so his magician ends up losing his money. I don't want to spoil the story or the movie if you haven't watched it. You fast forward, he later on comes into contact with a young family, and there's a little boy in that family, in the home where Lyle lives. He lives on the attic or the roof, and his name is Josh Prim. And he befriends Kyle, and they become fantastic companions and, great buddies. And the rest of the story as it goes shows, again, I don't want to spoil it for you, how through their friendship, eventually, Kyle overcomes his stage fright and he's able to sing and, find his life purpose and feels thrilled that he is now released. It's a great story. It's talking about friendships between two people and how, in the first case, the relationship between Kyle and the magician was more a relationship where the magician used Kyle and rather than valuing him and wanting the best, whereas with Josh Prim, the young boy, he really wanted Kyle to find his life's purpose and use his God-given gifts to really bring joy to the people as well as joy to him. That's a story for little kids, but sometimes relationships, especially about marriage, tend to be like that. Many of our church members, some of us are kids. Eventually you will grow up and you're going to want to marry someone. Some of you are in work. After college, you're thinking about marriage. Some of you are already married. But the question is, how do you find someone who would not be that kind of a person who uses you, but who would actually help you in marriage to do something that is a blessing to you and others? Match.com, some of you missed statistics, so I'm going to give you some statistics today. Match.com, they dug up some stats from their 2013 survey of singles in America. Did you know there is a singles week in September? I did not know that. So they surveyed 5,000 singles, men, about what they are looking for in their marriage partner and women. So in fact, they say when asked what they must have in a relationship, 98%, the looks were not the first thing, surprisingly. 98% of men said someone who treats them with respect. 97% said someone they can trust and confide in. And 95% said someone comfortable communicating their wants and needs. And 91% said someone with a sense of humor who can make them laugh. All right. And then I was trying to look for a similar survey for women to see what women want. And guess what? I could not find any online. I think even those who are married for more than 20 years are still trying to figure that out. What do women want? I'm just kidding. That's a joke. Okay, don't take that seriously. So here is Paul as he's working through this passage for us, and he's talking about various aspects of marriage. And we spoke last week. He gives a central thesis or his main anchoring point to say it's not about marriage that you need to spend time thinking about. It's about your identity and being happy and content and satisfied with who you are. And so we title that as You Are Enough, and how Christ is enough, and in Christ you are enough. And looking at marriage through this lens changes everything. If I am enough in Christ, that means I don't need to find a spouse who will make me complete. Christ has already made me complete. And that changes the marriage expectation and dynamic if you're looking for someone or even if you're already married to someone. If I am enough in Christ, that means I don't need to seek my sense of worth or seek to be in a bonding relationship or hold on to my spouse so tightly to give me my sense of safety and security and comfort and belonging. If I am enough in Christ, that means even if I lose my husband or wife and become a widow or a widower, Christ can fill all my needs as my provider, my protector, my comforter, and my ultimate bridegroom, and I don't have to feel I'm inadequate. It's not just a theoretical, rhetorical thing. And through all of this, Paul is digging deeper to make a very profound statement, which was profound 2,000 years ago, and it's profound even now, where he says, marriage is not the ultimate thing. So don't idolize it. There's something much more important than marriage, and which is living a holy life and living a life for God and building His kingdom. Being on mission is more important than just being married. If you're looking at marriage through that perspective, it's very freeing. It's freeing for you, it's freeing for your spouse, it's freeing for marriage. And when you seek to find someone, or if you are already married, if you bring this into your marriage, you will make a greater impact for Christ and your life can be more meaningful. So in this particular section, Paul is focusing on those who are single, who have never been married, and he touches about those who have lost a spouse. And he gives 4 reasons to tell people why the mission is more greater than marriage and how you can deduce 4 practical principles for your life. And these 4 principles are, if mission is greater than marriage, he encourages everyone, live wisely. And because mission is greater than marriage, he says live purposefully. Because mission is greater than marriage, live without anxiety. And because mission is greater than marriage, live freely. And that's what we are going to look today in the sermon that I have titled as Missional Marriages. You know, God is not interested in bringing 2 people together and giving them a happily ever after married life. God is interested in bringing 2 people together so their marriage can be a glorious, beautiful, missional marriage that both of them are on mission trying to together build His kingdom on earth. That's going to make good marriages great, great marriages spectacular. He's not undermining the other reasons for marriage as is described elsewhere in Scripture. Marriage is for companionship, but it's not just for companionship. Marriage is for being fruitful and multiplying, but it's not just for being fruitful and multiplying. Though these are wonderful and godly purposes for marriage, he makes another important point here about marriage, which is that God brings 2 people together to accomplish His purpose through them for eternity. Though the marriage is not for eternity, but what gets accomplished through a godly marriage stays for eternity. And he's trying to say it's not that only if you're married, you can be on mission and do this. Even if you are single, if you have a gift of being single and celibate, you can still be on the same mission. You don't need someone to come so that you can be on mission. So you are equally dignified and valuable, which was profound, as we are going to see, in ancient times, especially in the Roman culture. So that's his point. That's his drift throughout this whole thing. If you miss that and you read it, you will end up making all kinds of wrong conclusions about Paul's attitude towards marriage and about marriage itself. Because God's ultimate act in creation is to restore those who are fallen to him and building a new kingdom that lasts forever with him as the ultimate bridegroom and us as the ultimate bride, and he being our king that we can worship. And that's Paul's underlying point through all these verses. You have to read it with that lens. And so he says, whether you're single or you're married, it's not a big deal. It's not the ultimate thing. But being on mission is. And so if you are in mission together as a couple or seek to find someone like that, that can make your marriage to glorify God. Therefore, when he tells some people who are married, the church, in the Corinthian church, was putting tremendous pressure on people who are not married and those who are married because they had, as we said, two opposing views. One group of people viewed physical intimacy and sex as something dirty that defiles you, and so they said, don't get married, or even if you're married, get out of your marriage. And there was the other group of people that, and this group was influenced by Greek philosophy, which basically said anything that's physical or matter or earth is just not significant. And the other group went into the other extreme to say, pleasure is the only thing. And there is no life beyond death, so just enjoy and do whatever you want. And here Paul is telling if those who are not married, don't rush it if you don't have to. And so he gives few reasons why you don't have to rush into marriage. First thing we read before we do that, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 25 to 28, he says, now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. Ernest Becker wrote a book called The Denial of Death, and he won a Pulitzer Prize for that book. And Ernest Becker is a sociologist. He says, we are the first society in Western world that has a widespread belief that there is no ultimate future. We are the first society as a whole that's totally secular, which means that there are so many people who actually believe that when you die, you just go to extinction. Your personal consciousness is a very temporary thing. When you die, that's it. Everything ends. When the sun dies, all civilization goes away and nobody will be around to remember it. So Ernest Becker says there's never been a society that had such an understanding of the insignificance of human life. And as a result, he says there has never been a society that puts so much emphasis on finding your one true love. There's never been a society that puts so much emphasis on romance and true love. And he says, here's why he says it's fascinating, and he's right. He says, because even though as secular people, you still need to know that your life matters. You still want to have some kind of a higher meaning for your life. And if you no longer have God how do you get those needs met, right? And so for that, he says this occurs to the modern person that romance is the solution. The self-glorification that human beings need in our inmost being, we now look not to God, but we look for it in another love partner. Why do we want to do that? Is because he says we want to be rid of our faults, we want to be rid of our feeling of nothingness. We want to know that our existence has not been in vain. We want redemption. And so we believe without physical intimacy and romance and love, it's not possible to be satisfied. And it's the same challenge that Corinthians had. And so to them, Paul is saying, you are enough. Don't die to get married, or don't rush into marriage. And he gives a few reasons. And the first one we read is verse 26. He talks about living wisely, because he says in verses that we read, because of the present distress. You know, distress he's talking about, especially in that context, you know, historians say there is a global famine that was going around. It's part of the reason, even in the same letter, Paul writes to them about raising funds to support the Judean church. And so things were chaotic at a global level. Culturally, there was a lot of tension going around, and the Corinthian church was a very young church. It was only 4 years since it had been started. And so they are wrestling all these different theological things. There's no clarity about love. There is no clarity about marriage. And there are these two groups that are fighting and creating confusion. And so in that situation, Paul is telling them, don't rush to get married. You got to figure these things out. Don't look for someone to get married if your life is chaotic to begin with. Or if you are in a major crisis, that's not the time to find a person, because that person is not going to solve all your life's problems. Because you need to first discern the right person and also the right time. And here is a question of time that Paul is telling them, do not seek to do it. Because it's not about marriage. It's about, if you are going to get married, would it be better to accomplish God's mission, working towards bringing his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven through holy living? And if you're already married, you don't have to leave that situation to do this. But it says you're going to experience worldly troubles. And there are two ways you can experience worldly troubles if you're looking towards marriage. First of all, marriage in and of itself is bringing these two radically incomplete people who are trying to make this relationship work, two equally sinful people who are going to bring their anger, their irritation, their resistance, their stubbornness, and all of that. And it's going to be a long time. It's a lifelong commitment. So it's a one-way street. There's no way out, because God wants you to treat that as a covenant. And do you have the spiritual capacity and growth to embrace the journey and think of that as for your good, rather than at the slightest discomfort want a way out? So you need to have some spiritual maturity to do it. Otherwise, marriage is going to suck the life out of you. And if you jump into it, you're going to spend your energy laterally dealing with these issues, then forward towards moving God's kingdom purposes for your life. And worse, if you don't choose the right marriage partner wisely, that's going to be a tremendous challenge in and of itself. And if you're married to someone who's not a Christian, or those who are Christians but have deep character issues that they haven't processed and worked through, it's a challenge. And so here's a tip he leaves for the church and anyone who is not married to think about is, before you seek the right partner or person, find your mission, or at least the direction of mission. God's gifted you with specific gifts and talents and passions in your heart. At least find someone who partially aligns with that, even if you don't know the specifics, because that's going to carry you through. And I was sharing with you about our friends from Germany who are right now missionaries in Africa, the eye surgeon and his wife. We knew them when they were both single, and even before they had connected with each other, Jema and I would think and say, hey, these guys will make a great couple. And we actually tried to set them up, and that's another different story. We can tell you about that later. But God indeed brought them together, and you can see through all the challenges, I could seeing them after 20 years, they have become a more loving couple than they were before they knew each other. So find someone who has a mission, find someone who is godly, and instead of focusing too much on the finding, maybe focus on asking yourself, am I on God's mission? Do I have that holy living and godliness dialed in my life? If I don't, it's not fair to expect somebody else is. And is this the right time in my life? And he says, when you're single, you have so much freedom and liberty. You have all the time in the world to go and do what you want to do and dial all these big questions down and actually practice that. And Paul's words are profound. And those who are not married, an encouragement I would do is seek godly mentors in your life. Don't try to make these big decisions just by yourself. Nowadays, there's all these tons of dating apps, from globally available, whether it's in Asia, I don't know, called it Shadi.com or language-specific matrimony.com or whatever it is to, Coffee and Bagel and all those cool-sounding apps. But 70% of those who've used these find that they're so fake. People put up fake profiles, and you can't really find out who that person is. And it's funny, those days they used to mock arranged marriages, as so outdated and bad. But that's what arranged marriages were doing. They give you all the data for free. There is no monthly subscription. You also get free food and snacks every time. And I don't know if any of these apps give you that. But the point is, you can't find a person's character through that. But you can find a person's mission to that. And if you're already married, and if you think your marriage is not great, and if you are having challenges, the question you need to ask yourself is, what mission are we both on together? You don't have to do the exact same things, even though you're going to be very different, but do we have an understanding that our life here is for a bigger purpose? So first thing he says is live wisely. Don't let external pressures get to you and force you to make a decision. You need to ask if you are in the right place. And in some cultures, the thing is, okay, if you're finished school, next thing is marriage. Just find a guy, get married, and that's it. And if you're not married, you're looked down, and that's what happened. In Roman culture, actually, if you were single, they gave you 2 years to get married. Otherwise, there was a fine that the Roman government would institute because your sense of worth came from being part of a family or being a married person. And then internally in the church, they said, well, if you're single, it's actually better because you can live a more holy life. And so Paul's saying, don't let all these factors crush you. You discern to make a wise decision with all these parameters. Next, the second point is a continuation of this. He says, first is because, marriage is not easy. You're going to have distress. There's so much of things and discern the times. Secondly, he says, live purposefully, and because mission is greater than marriage. And verse 29 onwards, he says, this is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it, for the present form of this world is passing away. So it's just bizarre if you think of it. Why is he talking about marriage and the world is going to end? I mean, what's the connection between these two divergent truths? His point is the same. He's just amplifying his central thesis more. He says the time is short in the sense of Christ has come, and now it's just the next big thing that has to happen is Christ coming again to judge the world. And it's a short time. And in that sense, you're going to go through a lot of trials and challenges. So in that sense, you have to live purposefully. And he gives 5 imperatives in these 3 verses, 5 commands, because of this concept that time is short. And these are some very useful commands. First thing, he says, is let those who have wives live as though they had none. Which means, if you translate that, it says, don't hold on to your spouses too tightly. Because they're not the most important thing in your life. God is, and his mission is. And if you find someone whose mission aligns with yours, then you will not hold on so tightly or put too much pressure on him or her to do what you want them to do so you can get those desires of yours met. The second command he gives is of don't, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning. And why would you mourn? Why is he talking of mourning or becoming sad? Well, it is because life has challenges. Or you probably had expectations for marriage that did or did not work out. Or you're just waiting too long and you're not able to find that person and you're getting sad about it and letting that get under your skin. And he says, you don't have to do it. You can embrace that sadness and use that time to figure all these things out. And then he says, the third thing, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing. Which means he says, don't try to look at marriage as the thing that's going to give you the pleasure or the joy or the happiness that you want. Or if you actually found someone and you think they are a wonderful partner and you're thrilled about it, don't let that defocus you from your mission. Don't spend all your time, just having fun doing things, but try to use your time together to discern and see where is God taking you together. Fourth command he gives, the fourth imperative, is, and those who buy as though they have no goods. It says here again, don't let your focus on riches or what life has to give, be the focus and that derail you from mission. Don't try to see, I need to marry someone who makes this much money, or, if I'm going to give my son or daughter in marriage, financial stability is the big thing I'm actually going to see, even though I'm thinking I'm a Christian. So don't do that. That doesn't matter. God is the provider. You need to be looking at these other things. Is there about the mission? And third, he says, and those who deal with the world, the last one, fifth one, as though they had no dealings with it, for the present form of the world is passing away. Again, it says if you're trying to find meaning for your life in your work, or using that as a parameter to decide your life partner or whatever, don't do it. What matters is being on mission and living a holy life. So therefore, he says, live purposefully, because the time is short. And this is all the time you got. And you don't know how long you're going to live. You don't know how long your spouse is going to live. And most of the time, if in your marriage, you're daily fighting or you're going to fight about these things, it's going to derail you off from accomplishing this big purpose that God has for your marriage. And so try to find your life's purpose, and through that either look to find a partner, or if you're already married, this is how he says you can enhance your married life. And thirdly, he says, because the mission is greater than marriage, live passionately. And that's a corollary of living without anxiety. Verses 32 to 35. He says, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. Again in these short 3 verses, those of you who do the inductive kind of reading, like I've encouraged with marking words that are repetitive, that show you the author's original intention. What is the word that pops up multiple times in these 5 verses? Anxious, anxiety. In 3 verses, 5 times he talks about anxious. And he's contrasting 2 forms of anxiety. There is a godly anxiety, and there is a worldly anxiety. Why do you get anxious? What is anxiety all about? Anxiety comes because of unfulfilled passions or desires in our heart. And so he says, if you're going to have worldly desires and passions, any of these 5 things he has just spoken about, money, work, joy, pleasure, all of that, and you don't get this, that's going to keep you being on the edge and anxious all the time. Or you can have a godly anxiety when you are trying to live on mission. You're always anxious to help realize that mission that you're on. And there is this assumption that's somehow everyone has almost bought into, that there is someone just right for us to marry. And you just have to look close enough and you will find that right person. And as I've shared before, Tim Keller has said this, you always marry the wrong person, no matter what you think. Because you never know who it is that you marry. You just think you do. Whether it is women who think they have figured it out, or men who are still trying to find what the women want. And even if you do marry the right person, just give it a while, and he or she will change. And that's why I tell couples who come for counseling, no matter the history of how you found each other, whether it was coffee and bagel or eHarmony or Christian Single or Shadi.com or your parents arranged you, the history of the process of how you find each other has absolutely nothing to do, and it dissolves on the day you get married, because the next day you're total strangers to each other. Completely different. Because for marriage, which is a huge thing, you're not going to be able to stay as the same person that you are before you enter into it. Marriage also changes us. So we can't really be sure before we marry who the person will be that you're married to every 2 years. Stanley Hauerwas is a philosopher and theologian. He says the great challenge of marriage is learning how to love and care for the stranger to whom you find yourself married. An old Presbyterian minister called Lewis Smedes, he wrote this when he was in his 60s or 70s. He says, my wife, and listen carefully to this, words of wisdom, men, my wife has lived with at least 5 different men since we were wed, and each of the 5 has been me. That's what marriage does. So Paul is encouraging that you need to live passionately. If you want to have passion in your marriage, don't look for that passion in all these 5 worldly things. And he says, for men, he says, you need to have a godly anxiety for men. You need to be passionate about things of the Lord, one, how to please the Lord, and not how to please anybody else. Not wanting affirmation by finding or having that perfect spouse or that partner you want to know before marriage. And he says for godly anxiety for women, he says the same thing. Be anxious about the things of the Lord, being on mission. And he qualifies a different qualifying phrase, how to be holy in body and spirit. The emphasis is slightly different here, where he says you want to look for trying to find your beauty not in the shape of your body or in the jewels or external apparels, which he talks about in other places, but in the beauty of your heart. And then he gives comments to both of them of how they need not be anxious, should not be anxious from a worldly perspective. And that's the same. It says, for men, you shouldn't be anxious about worldly things and pleasing his wife. And for women, he says they shouldn't be anxious about worldly things and pleasing her husband. It's about being anxious for God versus the spouse. And because if you do that, you'll want to either hold on too tightly to them or you will feel you are in that place. And lastly, he gives another nugget of wisdom. Because mission is greater than marriage, live freely. Verse 36 to 38, he first talks about those who are single, and then he talks about those who are single because they have lost a spouse. Verse 36, he says, if anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry, it is no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart, to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. And if you look at again the words or thoughts that are repeating or where the focus is, these are the words that are power words that Paul uses. His things, passions, do, heart, desire, heart, do. So he's talking about this decision-making process and of, what should influence your thought and how you should navigate your passions and what you should do as a result. And it's not really talking, sometimes if you just look at it verbatim, it says if you're not behaving properly towards his betrothed. Is he just talking about the physical intimacy part? No, that's not what he is talking about. He says make a decision without compulsion because our decisions involve our heart, mind, and will. And don't let any pressures or compulsion hinder your decision making. Because those who are engaged, as I said earlier, were thinking of letting go of their spouse, succumbing to asceticism, but in his or her heart, they were actually not feeling that way. They wanted to be in that relationship. And they feel they have the ability to navigate the current challenges and they are ready. He says, then just go for it and do it. So he basically puts tremendous freedom on those who are in those decision-making roles. Don't do it under any pressure. But here is a guiding principle, he says. Just ask yourself, which of these options will be better for me in my life right now? And he has some closing comments for widows who are also single. Verse 39, he says, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. He applies the same principle to widows. And he's telling them, you don't have to be compelled because the Roman government is going to fine you if you're not married within 2 years. And Rodney Stark, he did some research and he points out in early Christian history, widows had a special privilege only in Christianity. because pagan widows were terrified because of this Roman government pressure to marry, and Caesar Augustus was fining them. But if there were widows in the church, they were honored, they were taken care of, and God says repeatedly throughout His scriptures that He is a God who cares for, and He will go in defense of the fatherless and widows and makes that as the social justice for the church to be involved in. And for the first time in history, widows had an elevated status. They were free. They were not under compulsion to do anything that they did not have to do. And so many women, if you look at church missions history, chose to remain single, whether they were widows or even not married, to accomplish spectacular things for God. And so he says, don't let anyone look down on you because you're a widow, which happens in many societies, including Asian cultures. A single woman is treated so terribly. I've seen that with my own mom when she became a widow when I was a 15-year-old teenager. They just go after you, and they want to make sure you're not normal. In Asian culture, if you're a widow, you're not allowed to wear flowers. You know, my mom loves flowers and the smell, so that's the first thing you can't do. It's terrible. And if there are social functions and weddings, if you're a widow, you're not supposed to stay in the front. That's terrible. Whereas in God's view, they are the most elevated ones and ones who deserve our utmost love and care and affection. And He tells them, don't worry about what the world looks at you. To me, you are my bride, and I love you, and I cherish you. But if they want to go and get married, He says, you're free to do that too. You don't have to let these things compel you. You need to decide and know and remember that being on mission is significant. And for that, it matters that the person, if you choose to remarry, is in the Lord. And you need to see if together you will make more impact for Christ. But irrespective of it, there is no worldly marriage that will give you your fulfillment and joy in life. But there is an ultimate marriage. You know, all marriages point to and find their ultimate meaning in the real marriage, the only marriage that lasts for eternity, and that is the marriage between Christ and His bride, that is you and me. Whether you are single, whether you're married, whether you're widowed, whether you're remarried, none of these marriages is going to give you that lasting joy and happiness. It is this marriage alone that is with Christ that will give us happiness. Every single one of us will find our perfect spouse only in Christ, because He's the only one who will always love you no matter how much messed up you are and how much you fall. He's the only one who will continue to provide for you every day and meet your emotional needs, your physical needs, your social needs, and fill you with His love, unconditional love, that any human spouse, even in the best of his ability, can ever do. So that's the marriage you all need to look up to. And it is the only marriage where your spouse, who is Christ, who is constantly sanctifying and making you a better version of yourself and redeeming you so you can be with Him forever and have the real, ultimate, happily ever after life with Christ as our spouse. If you remember the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman who already tried multiple relationships, 4 to 5 different people, still searching for that joy, and meets Jesus. And when she asks for living water, Jesus tells her, I am going to give you streams of living water. You will never be thirsty again. And then when she finally finds Jesus, The text tells us she's not rushing back into her village to find a spouse that she can finally get married and have herself met. She's bringing everyone to come and meet this Jesus who has now become her one true love. And that's what Jesus is asking you and me. Make me your one true love so that you're not seeking that and putting that high pressure on any other human being. C.S. Lewis says, if we let him, he will make the feeblest and filthiest of us into a dazzling, radiant, immortal creature, pulsating all through with such energy and joy and wisdom and love as we cannot now imagine, a bright stainless mirror which reflects back to God perfectly. Though, of course, on a smaller scale, His own boundless power and delight and goodness. The process will no longer be in parts very painful, but that is what we are in for, nothing less, because that's what Jesus is going to make you and me to be. So therefore, mission is greater than marriage. And when we are on mission, we will end up in this ultimate, perfect marriage. So I hope this is an encouragement for you today. If you are someone who is here in a relationship which reflects more like Lyle and the charismatic magician who was trying to exploit him, Hector, and you're feeling suffocated, there is hope for you. There is hope because Christ can bring meaning into your marriage, and as a couple you can pursue that. And if you're someone who is looking for that perfect partner, you can be free, knowing there is none except Christ alone, and seek to be that kind of person to somebody else who will live for kingdom purposes and value holiness more than happiness in your life.